So, as we have started a little bit late, I'm going to cut short my remarks and introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Harry Lewis, and he is my mentor, as well as one of the only practicing orgone therapists on the planet. And there are a few of us, and he is most senior at this point. And I would like you to welcome him up there for Wilhelm Reich, A Timeline.
Let me just quickly start by saying I might be senior, but I'm not one of the only orgone therapists practicing. There are a number of others who are present here today and who will talk, and some of you know. I just want to make a quick remark of thanks to a couple of people. Dr. Simonian, who really pushed and organized the idea of having a conference in New York. Being a New Yorker, I tended to be somewhat skeptical. But being an enthusiastic Californian visionary, he insisted on pushing through and getting it done. And it's very, very pleasing to see so many people. And there's a whole group of people who I and Dr. Daniel Schiff, who's out in Oregon, work with in Mexico City, who are here. Patricia Estrada, who is one of the directors of the training program in Latin America, and a number of other very, very devoted orgone therapists and practitioners. So that'll come up, I'm sure, over the day. What's most pleasing is to see that there are many people I don't recognize, which is really a delight. I'm used to speaking in groups in New York where I'm speaking to people I've known for like 40 or 50 years by now, and I've heard almost everything I have to say. Some of you might have heard what I have to say already, so if you know me, I tend to repeat myself, but since I'm senior, I can repeat myself. Anyways, I want to thank also Philip Bennett, who went to the trouble of doing technological work for me, which I couldn't even conceive of, in writing down my timeline, which I have in old-fashioned yellow note paper. He translated that to an actual PowerPoint. My wife would be proud. At any rate, what I want to do is just sort of set the context for what and how we get here today. And the key is the work of Wilhelm Reich. And it starts very early, actually, in his life. If I can do this right. First thing to consider is that Reich's life and work really are fundamentally identical. He was very clear about that. He says that on many occasions in lectures and discussions, and some of you may have listened to his tapes, which were available through the museum, through the trust. But Reich always felt that the key to his work, to his life, was that from a very, very early age on a farm in Galicia, he was focused on energy, and he was fascinated with the energy of animals, the energy of nature, and I don't think he was just being romantic, which he was capable of being if you read his first volume, his autobiography, Passion of Youth. But it stays very clear that what he does is, instead of following the money, which he was not very good at, he followed the energy. And that took him to many, many diverse and strange and wonderful places, even to outer space. And if Alexander gets there, and no telling what we'll find. So his life and work were always energy. Now, he's born in 1897 in Galicia, which is, when I was a kid growing up, it was referred to by most Jewish people as Rus Poland, meaning that Russia took it over, and Poland took it over, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire took it over, and it never really was settled. And it's very important to understand that it's an incredibly beautiful lake region, farm region. And Reich commented on that later in life, that part of the reason he wound up in Rangeley is that when he first saw Rangeley on a hiking trip, it reminded him of his home, his ancestral home. So he goes to Vienna in 1918, this is the result of a special scholarship that was awarded to veterans of the First World War. He was a lieutenant in the Austro-Hungarian Empire's army, realizing that the war was a disaster and futile and venile, really, in a basic sense. He took over a job up in the mountains away from the fighting, and eventually got out and got to Vienna, broke and destitute, and started to study law. Got bored with it, which is also interesting. Freud started with law and philosophy and got bored. Reich moved to medicine because that was where biology was, and where they were talking about the forbidden topic on some level, sex, and he was interested in that. He becomes a medical student and pays his way by tutoring other medical students while he's studying medicine, and gets his degree, moves on, is noted by his early, and Philip Bennett, who helped develop the timeline and knows much more about this than probably any of us here, except maybe Jim Strick, who we'll talk later. He begins to be noticed by around 1919 by what would be known as the inner circle around Freud, and they start looking at this young guy who seems to be really full of energy and full of curiosity and excitement, and he's invited into the psychoanalytic movement, which was, for young people, the place to be in Vienna. It was where things were really happening. The response of the old guard was that Reich was brilliant and talented, except he used the word sex too much. I guess a foretelling of things to come. Anyway, by 1923, 22, 23, he begins to publish and make a name for himself as a very, very talented researcher and scholar, as well as a clinician. He gets the notice of Freud, who begins to think of him as a potential person on the rise, and he is. During this time also, he begins to become fascinated with and interested in social activism. There are many events that happened in his life. Things were very, very unstable and radically violent during this period of time in Vienna, as well as Berlin and parts of the whole German, Austrian Empire that has fallen apart. He becomes very, very much increasingly radicalized, and finally begins to become deeply associated with the Marxist, leftist movements. Unlike most people who become enthusiastic leftists or Marxists or radicals, Reich did what he always did, is he studied. So he pulled back and spent a few months reading all of Marx, incorporating it into his work. I'm yet to find out, maybe Philip can inform us, or Jim, that I'm convinced he was also reading Engels, which if you read Marx, you read Engels in some sense. Because actually I think Marx is less important to Reich in some ways than Engels is. Engels really is a central influence on Reich's thinking and development. He's also reading Darwin, but most people don't realize this. Darwin was way ahead of Freud. Freud was frightened about the fact that Darwin was going to do it, and he was, except he died in 1872, and Freud gained all of Darwin's notes and information to develop his primacy. Reich understood that Darwin was really a central force in all of this. And if you really look at, we'll talk about it later and people can ask me, if you really look at Reich's development, I would say Marx, Engels, Darwin, and then Freud, even though Reich would say Freud was central, but Freud probably not as important as many other influences on Reich. Again, the people he seemed most interested in were the people who were most interested in energy. So by 1930 or so, he has risen to a position of leadership in the psychoanalytic movement, particularly in Vienna. He's the founder of the first clinical seminar. He goes to Freud and says, the problem is there is no, quantified or empirically established, technique and teaching and way of learning. And the way we used to work is one of the older members of the community would give you a card, say, be at such and such place at such and such time, a patient will appear. And then you would say, what do you do? And you say, talk to them. And he said, what do you do? When you run into a problem, come to me and ask me about it. So that was the way you were trained. And Reich talks about that in Reich Speaks on Freud. Reich established the technical seminar. Out of that technical seminar emerges what becomes known as his first major work, which is character analysis, which has a profound impact on the development of psychoanalysis. It's still to this day, there are a number of psychoanalysts present who can speak to that. Character analysis is still fundamental text in psychoanalytic training. So Reich becomes the go-to person in terms of what's really happening in terms of the movement of psychoanalysis. This also gets him noticed, but it also gets him into conflict with others who were less enthusiastic about his rise. By 1934, he has become clearly identified as a Marxist, we would say, but in reality he's active in the Communist Party and leadership and in the streets organizing. He's also active in the development of psychoanalytic work with the real people of the population in general. He is instrumental and the leader of the movement to found public health clinics called the Sex Pole Movement, with his wife Annie Pink and his close associate Otto Federhill. This both gets him a great deal of attention, but it also begins to upset Freud, who remains aloof, but orders, we know by from the Freud archives, orders Anna Freud, his surrogate, to take him down, and they did. By 1934, at the Lucerne Conference, International Conference Psychoanalysis, they organized a movement to oust him from the international psychoanalytic movement. I'm rushing through this. We can fill this out later. Maybe some of you know a lot of this already. I would refer you to a very, very good book in terms of timeline by David Boadella, who has his problems, but we won't go into that. But as a book, Wilhelm Reich, The Evolution of His Work, is usually available. And in terms of step-by-step how Reich developed, it's pretty good, if not excellent. Much better than Myron Sharif's Fury on Earth. Hopefully when Philip Bennett's book comes out, it'll add a little bit more to it. But Reich response to the attacks and to the active and successful attempts to remove him is to say, well, I don't need you. And he pulls back, settles down, reorganizes, and starts his own movement. At this point, it is primarily focused on character analysis, social activity, mass psychology, and the beginnings of biophysical work in what he will call vegetotherapy, which was, in our language, sounds a little strange, but in terms of what he was talking about, was work with the vegetative nervous system and understanding the vegetative nervous system, which is the beginning of what he will formally move to as moving beyond psychology. And one of the crucial things that I will emphasize in anything I talk about is that Reich is not at the end a psychologist. From actually about this point on, he becomes less and less a psychologist. You can listen to him on tape, tell the people studying with him that they are too rooted in psychoanalysis and psychology. They want to do too much character analysis and not enough real biological, biophysical, energetic study and work. Orgone therapy, as we tell our students, is not a psychological system. It uses psychology as a byproduct and as a way of understanding human experience in the world, but it is not the primary way in. Okay? So Reich is very, very clear about this by this time, and this corresponds to and lines up with the fact that he's also now a wanted man. He's in Berlin, where he's a roommate of Willy Brandt, who will, some of you might remember, becomes the president of the West German Republic after the war. Brandt was a leading leftist and close friend of Reich, and remained very, very positive and loyal to Reich to the end. There's film footage of him talking about Reich very positively. In those days, Reich was known as Willy. He changed to being referred to only as Dr. Reich when he came to the States. So he begins to realize that he has to get out of Berlin. This is around 1933, a little bit before 33. He's very clear, not only in his writing and studies, but in his activities, that it's not going to be very long before he and others are going to be hunted down. So he, under an assumed name, gets back to Vienna, takes care of his affairs, and begins to travel and becomes a wandering orgonomist, or to-be. He goes to Denmark, where they actively work to get him asylum. He's refused. He goes finally to Oslo, where with the influence of many individuals who are very, very powerful, he becomes a resident on a resident visa and begins to do active work. It's during this period of time that he begins to pull more and more away from doing active therapy, becomes primarily focused on vegetotherapy and character analysis and training of therapists. And I work in Norway very actively a couple times, 3 or 4 times a year. And it's amazing to realize, it's hard in this country to understand, the influence of Reich on Scandinavian mental health is profound. It is one of the central, body of work that informs many of the institutes, many of the hospitals. And to tell someone that you're a student of Reich's work or that you work in orgonomy is not something that's going to get you in trouble. It's going to get you usually a great deal of respect and interest. So his students at the end of the war took over the mental health movement in most of the Scandinavian countries. People like Nick Wahl and Ola Rocknes and others really influenced the development of mental health concepts and child development in Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Denmark. Sweden is a little less clear, but it's always a little less clear. So Reich, while he becomes increasingly central in what's going on in these countries, becomes less and less interested in teaching people to build careers as psychologists or as therapists or as doctors, and increasingly more and more interested in biological research and study of the nature of energy and human existence and life in general, the expressive nature of life energy. I think Jim Strick will talk to that, very, very eloquently, and I recommend fully his book on this period, Wilhelm Reich, biologist from Harvard University Press. It's absolutely detailed and excellent. So, I'm giving the 5-minute signal, so I'll do a quick speed up. All right. So in Norway, it gets clear through attacks on him from the fascist elements in Norway, which there were many. Don't forget, Quisling was if you know the term, was a leader of the fascist movement in the Scandinavian countries, particularly in Norway. So Reich realizes it's time to get out of Norway. And there's a whole big drama about how he gets out of Norway, which Phil Bennett can address more eloquently than I can. He decides that his choices are two. He either goes to, as A.S. Neal, his close friend and associate, is urging him to England, or he goes to the U.S., where his friend Vladislav Malinowski, the founder of modern anthropology, one of the founders of modern anthropology, is inviting him. Reich decides on America and the U.S. because it's less likely that the Germans are going to invade the U.S., at least not too soon. It's clear and expected that they will take England soon after taking the continent. So he emigrates in 1939 to the U.S. on a visa allowing him to come in because he's been invited to teach at the New School where I taught for 40 years, and they don't like to talk about Reich. There is some stuff in the archives, but he's not one of their heroes, like John Dewey and others. But in the United States, he founds a medical, psychiatry seminar and lecture at the New School for Social Research, and which, by all accounts, was standing room only whenever he talked. And he begins to do private practice in Forest Hills, Long Island, New York City, Queens. And begins to build a new movement now known as orgonomy, or Orgone science, and moves even deeper and deeper into research. So the doctors who trained with him, the last of whom died a few months ago, Dr. Morton Herskovitz, worked more and more in the laboratory as well as being trained to be orgone therapists. Okay, in the United States, he becomes increasingly involved in understanding the nature of and function of orgone energy, which he has discovered. And I will sort of sum up by saying, for Reich, the two fundamental principles that he felt he had really added to the mix and discovered was the function of the orgasm, which I will talk about later, and or the discovery of orgone energy. And he was clear that this energy he was not the first to know about this energy or realize the existence of this energy. He was the first to materially demonstrate it as a collectible, workable, usable form of energy with very, very specific characteristics, which we will also talk about today. This research and work and beginning and increased interest in what he called the biopathies, or illnesses, diseases, and how they could be treated, gets him into increased position to be attacked by the existing authorities. And it's complex, and I think Phil Bennett also will talk about this. He's attacked really by the groups on the left, groups on the right, and by the functionaries of the American Food and Drug Administration and Medical Association who begin to actively and persistently attack. It's very hard for us to understand just how vicious this was and how massive this was. As a kid, I can remember seeing the New York Post, which was a leftist liberal newspaper in New York City at that time, writing articles about this crazy doctor who was very, very dangerous and had to be gotten rid of. And this was sponsored, okay. So this leads to the finale, which is He's attacked by the Food and Drug Administration, brought up on charges as being a quack and a fraud and a medical charlatan. And eventually, through various backs and forths, he is convicted of refusal to honor an injunction and a failure to appear to answer a warrant, not for any other crime. He's sentenced against everybody's recommendation, including people in the prosecution, to 18 months in prison, where he dies on November 3rd, 1957, in federal prison, close to the end of his 18-month sentence, and died officially of a heart attack, probably brought on by the flu. There's some conspiracy theories that this was staged and set up, but there's no evidence of that has appeared thus far. But at the end of his life, this man who was supposedly a fraud and a crank and a money hustler was totally destitute and broke. The estate was $300 some odd thousand in debt, or different figures are thrown around, but it was in shambles. It was preserved by the doctors who remained around him, the orgonomists who remained around him, and eventually a woman who was a patient of one of the doctors, Mary Higgins, who recently died, took this on as her life work and saved what was remaining of the estate and put it back in shape, and managed by 1960 to get Reich's work back in print. The last thing I'll say is Reich's books under this injunction and under this persecution were banned. All the books, every single piece of literature was banned and taken out under the supervision of Dr. Sobey, who I worked with for years, to gangs of war Pier, over in the village by the Hudson, and burnt in incinerators. And just end with the last story is Dr. Sobey, who was there supervising this. I have much of the remains of that library and book collection because he and Dr. Handelman threw books into laundry bags while they were throwing them into the carts for the federal agency. Dr. Sobey ran into one of the guards, the guys who was burning the books, who was crying, and he asked him, "Why are you crying?" He said, "I don't understand this. I don't know anything that's going on here." He said, "I just came back from the war. I was in Germany. We were there to stop this kind of thing, and here I am having to do it now." And that was the end of Reich's work for close to 5 or 6 years, 10 years. 1960, Mary Higgins began to slowly bring work back in with the help of Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, the publisher. Okay, so the aftermath is what we will talk about later on today. That's my quick run through.